speaking of inclusion and families, how can practitioners and nurseries include families in discussions specifically around race to build a more inclusive community and to allow children to expand their understanding when they're at home?
So the new Birth to Five Matters materials actually says talking about race is the first step in countering racism. So the best thing that practitioners can do is actually begin that discussion. So, like you've just said, one great way that we can do this is actually to share and celebrate children's own lived experiences. So thinking about their own lives and what they things that they might experience at home, and as we've talked already about different cultures, people might have different festivals, different celebrations, different ways of being, and finding out from parents and carers using this information, so that we can include things like different foods or artifacts or clothing or music or something in our settings. So that's a good place to start. Trying to avoid making any assumptions is also really helpful. So inviting parents and carers and grandparents to visit if we're allowed to, that would be great. And again, when we're allowed, taking children on visits into their local community. They can think about where people might live and perhaps where they worship, and showing different people who might make up the communities. But I don't know if you've come across Liz Pemberton and her work. She's so she calls herself the Black Nursery Manager, and she's really clear that when we're talking about race, we need to avoid a colourblind approach. She says this is dismissive and harmful, and so it's really important and healthy actually to see colour. And we need to have a much deeper understanding of race and racism and racist practice. And so we need to make sure children can see themselves, for example, reflected in our resources in the settings. And that will include skin colour as well. So children need to be able to see resources that reflect the whole world, the diversity that's within society, but also thinking about themselves, because representation does matter. And this is back to that idea about belonging, because being colourblind actually says we don't see the child, and it implies that all children are the same, which obviously they're not. Right. And it doesn't acknowledge the racism and the fact that colour of skin actually has a massive impact on people's lives. And it also implies that we don't really have an understanding of diversity. So I was lucky enough to work with Liz Pemberton on the inclusion section of Birth to Five Matters. So if you don't mind, I'm now going to read you a little quote from that document, because I think it's really helpful around this point.
Yeah, go for it.
So, it is a mistaken assumption that treating all people the same way and ignoring differences in race is a sufficient response to racism. This approach simply allows the continuation of bias in society, which disadvantages people from Black and minoritized groups. Instead of a colourblind approach to race, more proactive anti-racism is needed. Practitioner training is an important step forward toward opening dialogue and developing understanding about white privilege, systemic racism, and how racism affects children and families in early years settings. It's also time to challenge the widespread notion that children do not see race and are colourblind to difference. When adults are silent about race, children's racial prejudice and misconceptions can be maintained or reinforced. Encouraging dialogue and conversation about difference can evoke children's strong sense of fairness and break down false assumptions about everyone being able to succeed on their merits, so that children recognise racist behaviours and develop anti-racist views. So I thought it was easier just to sort of read that rather than try and summarise. But what we really need to be doing is being proactively anti-racist and challenge racism and racist remarks at any level when we encounter them. But sadly, so many people are ignorant to race and racism, and they might, like myself, come from a background of white privilege. And that actually means, I've never encountered racism. I don't fully understand it. So talking about these issues, although it can be very difficult at times, is definitely the first step, the best way forward.